Hi, welcome to Chad's Silversmithing. Before we get too far into the video, if you wouldn't mind hitting the like button, that really helps to get my channel promoted, and I appreciate it. I also love it when people leave comments, so if you have questions, constructive criticism, ideas for videos, how you do things, I'm always interested to hear those things as well. So I'm going to do something a little different. Normally Thursdays are for multi-project videos, but today I'm going to do something I've been putting off doing for a while, so I thought it was about time to finally get around to it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put together a list of raw materials that I would recommend that beginners maybe consider getting when they first get into the hobby, as well as a list of the things that I get that are different from those. So I get asked pretty frequently by people, I've got all sorts of tools now, but I don't know what raw materials I should get for various projects. Before we get going on that, though, I'd like to thank some groups of people. First off, my patrons. I'm pleased to announce that I have a new patron, Sylvia T. Thank you for signing up. I really appreciate your support. I think you'll find that my Patreon is full of a bunch of really nice people who know a whole bunch of stuff about jewelry making. So I hope you can tap into their knowledge as well as mine. So thanks for signing up. Thank you to my other patrons for being such good supporters. I really appreciate all that you do. The other group is my YouTube subscribers, and we just passed 14,800. That's amazing. I can't believe we're at that stage, and I really appreciate all of the kind comments that you leave in the comment section. That's really nice, and it helps me to know that I'm helping some people, so that makes me feel good. And thank you also for the financial support, the Buy Me a Coffees and the Super Thanks. Those really help with the raw material costs right now, so thank you for that. All right, well, let's get started on this video. This is one of my design idea sketchbooks. I've found in recent times that I do a better job, I get a better outcome if I sketch things out in advance. This particular version has some conversion tables on the back, fractions of an inch to decimals to millimeters, which helps me because I'm trying to use the metric system more. But these are available on my merch store if you're interested. Today I don't have any sketches in them so much as just information that I'm going to talk about. So one of the more frequent questions I get is, I've got all my tools, but I don't know which raw materials to buy to get started, because a lot of times people have taken a class or two, and so they've made a specific one or two things and they don't know where to go from there. And so I will talk about some basic materials that you might want to get. I'll talk about some things that I get outside of those basics, and then we'll talk a little bit about a few things relevant to buying silver. So hopefully that'll be useful to you. But to start with, as a beginner, what are some good things to buy? Okay, as a good place to start for beginners as far as different types of wire, when I started, I made a lot of bands just to get some good soldering practice in, and some good sizes of half-round wire, sterling half-round, that make nice bands are 8 gauge and 6 gauge. I would say just get some 8 gauge to start with. You'll end up, let's see, I've got some 8 gauge here. This is 8 gauge half-round, just to give you an idea for its size. And not only can you make a bunch of silver bands, you can also make ring bands for other purposes, like when you have a stone. Here's another example where I have a stone mounted on top with 2 pieces of those, 2 pieces of that 8 gauge half round. So that's really handy for a lot of beginning projects. I make ring bands out of that all the time. You can also solder some other stuff to the edges of it to make it look a little different. So that's an important, good one to get. Various pattern wires. Here's some examples of those. Most jewelry companies will have some pre-made pattern wires like this. This is just a few examples. I don't have a lot of variety right now, but periodically I'll order some different ones. They also make a way for you to change up the bands on things and use them for various other purposes. Like hoop earrings or bracelets. There's lots of purposes for these kinds of things. And just if you want to change up instead of using plain silver bands all the time, you could do some pattern stuff. And that's just a few of those. There's a lot of different kinds. As far as round wire goes, I'd get two different gauges. 18 gauge. Here's some 18 gauge. 18 gauge is a small round wire. It's not so small that it's flimsy and weak, but it's not so big that it's you can't use it for some relatively fine decorations. This is an example of using 18 gauge round wire to create some designs, and that's so you can get some pretty decent detail out of stuff like that. And I use 18 gauge round for a lot of internal decorations on things. It's a good general all-purpose one to use for decorating stuff. It's also good for if you want to make those twisted wire ropes to go around stones. 18 gauge is a good size to do a couple of pieces of that twisted together look nice. So the other one is 14 gauge round, and I use these for a lot of ring bands or a lot of bolder kind of decorations. Like the last video I made, I did a maple leaf, and some of the stems I used the thicker stuff here, and then I used a little bit thinner stuff for some of the other offshoots from the stems. But this is a good one for bands too. If you solder two of them together and split them apart at the ends, it makes for a nice ring band. Let's see if I have an example there. Here's an example of a ring band where I used 14 gauge round and just soldered two together and split it around there. So, as far as square wire goes, and I know a lot of people don't use square wire, but I think square wire works really well for a lot of stuff. And I like geometric stuff, so I find that it's useful to have this around. This is 14 gauge square. You can use it for ring bands like I did this one the other day. It's two pieces of square wire soldered together that split. You know, you just have them spread out at the end so they don't solder any further than that point. And it comes out looking really nice. So that's a good solid size of wire to use for a lot of different things. So that's a good one to have around. The other thing I use square wire for a lot is occasionally I'll want to have something that's sort of rectangular in profile, and if I take square wire I can roll it through a rolling mill, and that'll make it flat in one dimension or flattish in one dimension, and that's really nice for a lot of situations. So, and then as far as sheet, 26 gauge sheet is a good place to start with. 26 is not terribly thick, but for the kind of things you're doing as a beginner generally, it works great for the backs of bezels. It's not so heavy that it's hard to cut. It's just a generally good size of sheet to use, and as expensive as silver is right now, it's not going to cost you near as much as some of the thicker stuff. So we will talk about price at the end. So that's most of the basics for just sterling silver I would start with. There's, you know, if you have a specific piece you're trying to make and it requires something different, of course order those materials, but that's a good general batch of materials to start with. There's a few other things though you'll need starting out. For bezel, I use fine silver bezel because it's a little bit more malleable. Most people do, as far as I know. The size that I would recommend for beginners is 3/16 inch, which is 4.76 millimeters. And I like the little bit thicker stuff, which is 26 gauge, and 26 gauge is 0.41 millimeters. That's also for the sheet that I was just talking about. One of the reasons I recommend the thicker stuff for beginners especially is because notoriously, when I first started and throughout all of the classes I've taught and watching people start this, bezels, because it's fine silver and because it's relatively thin stock, people just mangle them. And so if you have a little bit thicker stock, it's going to stand up a little bit to more abuse at first. You get better with bezels as you go along, and they become less trash looking by the time you're done. But starting off with some thicker stuff will give you a little bit of more forgiveness as far as beating it up. You have more you can polish away on is part of the reason. So I like the 3/16 or the 4.76 millimeter height because it's tall enough for most stones that you'll run across, especially at the beginning. And if you want it to be shorter, you can just file it shorter. That way you only have to get one size, you know, or you can cut it in half. I do that every once in a while when I need a really short bezel. Okay. Now I wanted to talk about solder a little bit, but solder is kind of a more complicated thing to talk about because different people solder things in different ways. I do things a little bit unconventionally in that I almost always use hard silver sheet solder. And most people who do silver work, they use multiple different kinds of solder in each piece. And the rationale behind that, I understand the rationale, and it makes sense logically. Because if you start off using the highest melting temperature solder and solder some things together, then you want to add more components to your piece that you're working on. You use the next one down that melts at a little bit lower temperature, so you're trying not to reflow the previous solder so you don't have any issues with things falling off or whatever. And just work your way down the line of the various types of solder with the lowering melting temperatures. That is fine if you solder that way. I have a tendency just to use the hard silver sheet solder, and I've learned over time how to manage the heat and the flame so that I can get away with that. I do occasionally use easy solder. Anymore, I've kind of relented and started doing that once in a while, but for the most part, I haven't needed that. The reason that I can get by with it is because let's see if I can explain this. Generally, unless you have something really awkwardly put together that has a lot of weight hanging off out in the air, or gravity is going to have a tendency to pull things apart, then even if you reflow solder joints, the surface tension of the liquid will generally hold it together, like I said, unless there's some really big imbalance. So if you arrange things on your soldering surface with T-pins, or you solder things while they're flat so there's nothing up in the air, you almost never need to use anything but hard silver sheet solder. So, but again, I do that unconventionally, and if you're taking a class and your teacher says to use multiple types of solder, use multiple types of solder. That's fine. It's just a personal preference. So let me tell you a little bit about the different kinds of solder. I get sheet solder, and I like sheet solder because you can cut little tiny pieces exactly the size you want. They don't roll around on you like wire solder does when you cut little pieces of it. And I can do virtually everything that someone using wire solder to point solder with the actual wire can do, except I can even control exactly how much solder goes into that solder joint because I cut the solder in advance. So same purpose as using the wire to point solder, but pick soldering with hard silver sheet solder works best for me. So again, personal opinion, everybody develops their own style, and that's fine, and that's good actually, because sometimes you can learn new things from other people. So there is wire solder, like I was saying. There's also paste solder, which is convenient for some situations. Pepe Tools, who I'm an affiliate of now, sent me some different paste solders, which I'd never tried before, and I really like using them. They're kind of handy sometimes. So every once in a while, a need like that comes along, and that's handy. So, but yeah, so solder is kind of a personal preference, and kind of also how you learned how to do it, and kind of what works best for you. So pick accordingly for those ones. As far as some other raw materials that you use up, flux you use when you're fluxing your piece. I use a mixture of boric acid and alcohol, I believe it is. It is a liquid green flux that is self-pickling, so it dissolves some of the oxides on the surface as well as coating it. I like that one, but there's no reason you can't use whatever kind of flux that works best for you, so there's lots of different choices. As far as pickle safe, which is what you clean up your piece in when you're getting ready to finish, or when you're prepping it for the next soldering operation, some people do that. I use a sulfuric acid based one called Rio Pickle, and the good thing is there's lots of less toxic versions out there if you want to use, I know they make a a citric acid based one that's supposed to actually work pretty well. So do some research and you'll find there's lots of different options for that. The other thing is I use cold pickle, but most people heat it in a little crock pot kind of situation. It makes it work faster if you do that, but I like the convenience of just having it in a jar and I can just throw it in there. It just takes a little bit longer for it to clean up if it's not heated. So that's basically the raw materials I would get as a beginner. And let me tell you about a few things that I buy also now that I've branched out and have been making a lot more different and diverse things. I find it's useful to have some different sizes of sheets, some different thicknesses. If you're going to make big, thick, bold rings, having some really thick sheet like 18 gauge, this is 18 gauge, which is 1.02 millimeters thick. It's expensive, but it makes for nice bold rings, so I use that for that a lot of times. In between this 26 and the 18, I have 22. And if I need something just a little thicker than 26, which it happens on occasion, I have this available. So not as expensive as this, but more expensive than that. So some different round wires that I didn't talk about earlier that I use are 20 gauge round, and I use that to make ear wires a lot of the time. I buy it pre-hardened so that I don't, if I'm just going to make an ear wire out of it, I don't have to twist it or anything to work harden it to make it stiffer. That's about the, oh, I do get some 22 gauge round wire for a few really fine detailed things occasionally, but not very often. Square wire, I use multiple different kinds of square wire besides 14. I use 12 gauge, which is 2.01 millimeters, and I use, that's a little bit thicker than 14. And I use 10 gauge, which is even a little bit thicker than that. 10 gauge is 2.59 millimeters, so I'm still trying to memorize all of the different millimeters for the different gauges. Square wire like that thick is useful for a lot of situations. I just use this for a bracelet I made for my Patreon, which I don't think I have down here. I'd show you, but it makes for a nice thicker, solid, heavy wire. So, half round wire. The other gauge that I use the most is, you can see in comparison to the 8 gauge, 6 gauge is a little bit thicker. It's 4.09 millimeters wide versus a 3.25 for this, I think. And I also get 12 gauge, which is a little bit skinnier. I don't think I have any right at the moment, but I use that every once in a while too. And 12 gauge is 2.01 millimeters. So there's a couple of other types of half round wire that I use a lot. These are two different types of low dome half round wire. Low dome just means that it's not a complete half of a cylinder, so it's more spread out and flatter this way. And I like these for ring bands of various types if I want a bit bolder ring band, and quite a few other uses. So this is, I forget the numbers. I think this is number 5 and this is number 2, but I may have it backwards. So they have 5 or 6 different sizes of this low dome. I like these two the best, but you know, you can use whatever you want, whichever suits your purposes. So the other things that I get that I didn't mention for beginners are I get some other types of bezel. I generally keep some that thinner 28 gauge 3/16 inch, which is 4.76 millimeters tall. And I also keep some 1/4 inch around, if I can find that. Here's a piece of it. You can see it's quite a bit thicker or taller than that stuff. The reason I keep that around is every once in a while you run into a really deeply cut cabochon, and this stuff just isn't tall enough. And so it's nice to have something just a little bit taller to use once in a while. So you don't run into that situation that often, but every once in a while. So that's handy to have around. So I also get some triangle wire occasionally. I like using this really thick, I think this is number 2 triangle wire, number 2. And this is kind of expensive because it's really thick and you don't get that many, I think it's about an ounce for every 6 inches or so. But it makes nice bracelets. You can twist them, you can I did one just last week, I think, where I cut a section out and mounted a little amethyst in the middle and made it into a cuff. But they seem to be pretty popular. I also get some smaller triangle wire occasionally for some specific things, but don't need it that often. The last thing that I get that I didn't mention for beginners, because most times beginners don't do hinges or anything at that stage, and that is different sterling silver tube. I buy some in various sizes that fit different gauges of round wire into them, so I can use that as the pin and it fits in there snugly. And that's mostly what I use tube for. So a couple of final thoughts about getting materials. The prices of metals, precious metals, fluctuate pretty frequently. For instance, when I first started doing this in the mid-90s, silver was $4 an ounce. I think last I looked, it was $31 an ounce, and it's gone up about $6 or $7 per ounce over the past year, I think. But it fluctuates up and down depending upon different forces in the marketplace. I'm hoping that it doesn't get too much higher, because right now it's relatively expensive. But the good thing to know is, even if it's high right now, probably will come down. One thing you might consider is if you have a lot of scrap left over from previous projects that you can't use, you can always sell it when it's really high, and then sit on the like if you go through some of the jewelry companies, they'll give you credit on your account at that dollar amount, and then if you sit on it for a while and the price goes back down, you can get a lot more raw materials for cheaper. So it kind of is a way to save yourself some money if you have the patience to wait that long. And you never know, it might not go down for a long time, so it's kind of a gamble. But the second thing I was going to say is scrap can be sold back. So all that stuff, those little dust and the little snipped off pieces that you have laying all over your floor, sweep those up and send them back to your jewelry supplier, and they will give you credit generally. It's worth it, because every once in a while I'll clean up all my scrap and I'll send it back, because I'll have 5 or 6 pounds of silver scrap, and that adds up quite a bit to some nice raw materials to save yourself some money. So the cost you're paying when you're buying raw materials from a jewelry supply company is not going to be spot price. Spot price is what the silver is going per ounce on the open market at any given moment, from my understanding, and it's per troy ounce, which is slightly different than your traditional ounce. It's a little bit bigger. Jewelry companies will sell you silver at spot price, plus they'll add a fabrication charge, because you're buying something that's been turned from just raw silver into either wire or sheet or something, and there's a cost associated with manufacturing that stuff, and so that's the upcharge you get when you buy silver from one of these companies. You're paying spot price plus a fabrication charge, so it's never going to be as cheap as you think. Most of the jewelry companies that I've dealt with have a quantity price break involved. So if you buy more ounces of silver, they have certain points where you hit a plateau, or you hit a benchmark, I should say, and it drops the overall price of the silver you're buying. So if you buy at least 6 ounces, it drops it a little bit. So you pay a little bit less per ounce. You hit 12 ounces, you pay a little bit less per ounce than that. So it's probably worth it to look into that. I mean, if you're 1 ounce away from a price drop, you might save yourself some money. So my best advice to you, if you're a beginner, is to buy some of those basic raw materials. Watch some videos, take a few classes, and play around with some of that stuff. Don't be too concerned with your outcomes, but be concerned about learning how to manipulate the raw materials that you have into what you want them to be. So if you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comments. I'd love to answer questions, and I'm curious also, what essential materials do you have that you would recommend to other people that you use a lot? I went over my most frequently used ones, but I'm sure other people have different things that they use quite frequently. So Tell me in the comments what you like to buy best as far as raw materials as well. So, all right, well, I hope you got some basic information about getting some raw materials out of this one and what you might want to invest in. If you did, make sure to hit the like button before you leave. I'd love to have you subscribe to my channel as well. I'd love it if you visited my main YouTube channel page, because I have now, I'm approaching 400 videos, which is amazing. I can't believe I've done that many videos, but there's a lot of content here. And if you enjoyed this one and found it useful, there might be some other stuff you'd find useful. So check those out. Make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you get notifications when I put out a new video, which is 3 times a week. And don't forget to hit the video description down below in case you want to get yourself one of those nice design idea books. There's a link to my merch store. You can also get my ebook that I published, which is a guide to my 2023 videos, and that's a good way to support the channel. And there's even a link to my Patreon if you want to check that out. So it's a nice community over there. All right, well, thanks for coming. Take care. Happy silversmithing.